Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another 40k lore video. I was kind of planning to do the Death Watch already, but it's taking me a little bit longer, so I figured I'd do one of those relatively short but important ones instead, talking about the Tau, which I've also haven't talked about in quite a while. In this case, more specifically, one of their little subservient races, the Vespid. This is a rather fascinating little species because it has a gift that very few sentient creatures do, namely the ability to fly without mechanical or other aids. They are natural-born little flappy things that can fly around apparently most climates, which is also quite interesting, considering their homeworld is essentially a gas giant. You would expect it to have a very different sort of climate, atmosphere, and, well, pretty much everything and anything compared to most other worlds. Additionally, their wings aren't that big, so how on God's earth they are generating enough lift to actually keep them flying is, well, not entirely clear. Even the Tau are in fact keeping that particular secret a bit close to their tiny little communist hearts. All we do know is that it's not what we would usually consider to be flight, as in it flaps its wings and generates lift. It is some kind of combination of that, or possibly something entirely different. It might even have something to do with their very strange crystal alloy that is only found on their homeworld. And let's talk a little bit about that crystal alloy first and foremost, because, well, it is pretty much the single thing that the entire Vespid society is built upon. Apparently, the Vespids have a rather fascinating genesis story. They, as I mentioned, are all born on a gas giant, which in and of itself would make it, well, rather damn difficult for sentient life to exist. It is, after all, a gas giant. It's not the kind of place where life, generally speaking, flourishes, and certainly not relatively advanced life in the form of a bipedal creation capable of wielding relatively advanced technology. Then again, this is 40k. They could have been seeded there eons ago by the old ones for all we know. So it's certainly not entirely impossible that life could flourish despite the rather hostile environment. Now, upon this gas planet, you of course have to have some form of land, otherwise, well, they really couldn't live. At the very least, not in that fashion, not building an advanced society, etc., with cities and so on. Instead, they live aboard giant floating rock islands that are filled with lighter-than-air gas. These massive floating landmasses therefore sustained the Vespid civilization on what can be considered relatively solid ground. Now, I must admit, I'm half tempted to dive into the various physics of this, considering that a lighter-than-air gas capable of holding up this massive of a superstructure would have to have a fair bit of lift in it. It would also have to be basically entirely gas-tight so that it can't escape. Otherwise, these things would inevitably fall down into the horrible miasma of other gases farther below. It also introduces all manners of problems when you take into account that you can't really be using a whole lot of these gases or separating them in any way. For example, if the atmosphere was made up of oxygen and the population was breathing it, then that would produce carbon dioxide, which would be heavier than air, and therefore it would affect the buoyancy of this floating landmass rather poorly. The problem is, we don't actually know what the Vespids are actually breathing, so it could be some entirely unknown gas that we simply don't know how functions, and therefore it makes sense, although the whole floating island thing is probably relatively complicated to get working within an ecosystem like the ones used by the Vespids. I mean, you could technically, I guess, have a form of an oxygen gas giant, but the problem is, hydrogen exists, as far as we know, pretty much everywhere, and oxygen plus hydrogen turns into water, which means you wouldn't really have a gas giant at all. Yeah, I'm thinking I'm just going to skip this entire thing because this is going to lead me off on one hell of a merry little dance if we start diving into it. And we don't really have enough information to do it either. So let's just skip over this somewhat fantastical fact and move on to another fantastical fact. Namely, the magical, mysterious crystals that the Vespids have built pretty much their entire society upon. These magical, mysterious things are... well, one hell of a deus ex machina, really. They're located down in the bottom layer of their giant floating continents. And apparently it is remarkably uncomfortable all the way down there, to the point where only the larger and bulkier female Vespids can actually reach them. Which does make sense, they are basically an insectoid species, and in those species, the female tend to be larger than the males. Come to think of it, it does sound like a rather wonderful society. Basically, the women are off all the day working in the mines, and the men are simply just playing around with their toys. And what marvellous toys they are too. This is another reason why I suspect that the Vespids were probably planted there by the old ones, because they have a remarkable level of synchronicity with their environment. You see, these magical mysterious crystals can be used for practically anything and everything, except, apparently, space travel, since that was one of the very few things that the Vespids haven't already developed all on their very own. But here's the kicker. These crystals would be utterly and completely worthless for pretty much any other species, as they only activate properly once they are fed a certain frequency that can only be generated by the Vespid's wings. Now, isn't that just a remarkable fucking coincidence? Now, you could argue that they developed their wings specifically to take advantage of these crystals, but they also developed diamond-hard claws to dig their way through the bedrock of their floating continents that just so happened to produce the exact environment, the only environment in the entire goddamn galaxy capable of producing these very crystals that only react to these specific frequencies generated by this specific species' wings. And, apparently, the only limitation is that it can't be used to power spacecrafts. You know, what they would have to rely on the old ones to provide. Yeah, whilst the galaxy is a pretty goddamn big place, and you should never say never, I think my theory of created by the old ones is probably the more likely one out of the two here. Anyways, since they had never created any spacefaring technology, they were eventually discovered by the Tau, who saw these creepy little insectoid bee monsters and went, hey, useful. They tried to initiate diplomacy with them in the usual Tau fashion, but they ran into a little bit of a problem. You see, the Vespids are rather unique little bastards. First and foremost, they have 3 sets of double eyes, for 6 in total, with 1 capable of perceiving ultraviolet rays, 1 capable of seeing in infrared, and 1 apparently being able to see in the normal visual spectrum. I hesitate to start speculating what normal could possibly mean on a gas giant of unknown makeup, but apparently they can see more or less like normal people in a normal atmosphere, which is not at all how vision functions, by the way. The reason why we can see the way we can see is based upon our atmosphere. The density of it, the molecules of it, etc., etc. It is how we understand the ideas of colors. If we had been raised on a completely different planet, with a completely different atmosphere, or even, indeed, not even a different planet, but a different environment, we would perceive the visible spectrum very, very differently. See, for example, studies made on various deep-sea creatures which see, quote-unquote, in an entirely different way than we do. Look up the mantis shrimp, an absolutely fascinating little creature, by the way, which sees in like 700 million spectrums more than us. Not quite that much, but it is basically able to see colors that we couldn't even imagine because it has been raised in an entirely different environment. Granted, those aren't the only reasons, but I'm not going to launch into a lengthy expose on the way the mantis shrimp sees things in a Vespid video. That'd be kind of wandering off the point after all. Anyways, the point remains, the Vespids are creepier looking little dudes with very little in common with most other bipedal sentient creatures. If the whole magical special vibrating wings and mystical magical crystal things didn't already give that one away, quite obviously. Their peculiarities, however, also stretched into the range of communication. You see, the Vespids communicate using pretty much their entire bodies, literally speaking. The vibrations of their wings, that's an element. The way they're winking their creepy little eyes, that's another element. The mouth sounds they make are also an element, and the smells they emit is a further element. And out of those, it is actually the smell part that is the most important. That is the one that conveys the most meaning and is used as the most general form of language, with the other ones being used to convey more subtle meanings. This rather massive language barrier was a rather obvious problem for the Tau watercasts that had come down and tried to explain to them the value of the greater good. And the Vespids responded with, quite predictable, violence. It turns out the Vespids weren't actually too fond of the blue-skinned aliens that wandered down to their planet's surface and started burping mouth noises at them. But as always, the Ethereals had the answer. They ordered the creation of a special communication device that combined the various modus of communication used by the Vespids into one handy-dandy fit-all package, including a form of smell communication. Once the Vespids were given these things, presumably by capturing one and forcing it onto his face, considering their lack of cooperation up until that point, they suddenly became very, very cooperative indeed. They went from being intrinsically hostile to the Tau to instantly understanding and valuing the idea of the greater good. In fact, they valued it so much that they practically begged the Tau to allow them to become a part of the greater empire. Quite the turnaround, isn't it? Quite the fucking turnaround. One wonders if the Ethereals didn't mix something interesting into the smell-based communication system. After all, there is suspicion that the Ethereals are using some chemical means of controlling the Tau, rather than just simply being really, really good orators. There is also the suggestion from certain Imperial Inquisitorial agents that they might be using some form of naturally produced pheromone. In other words, I'm basically saying that some Tau Ethereal has been farting into these communication devices for quite some time, and that has given the Vespids a far more nuanced understanding of their place within the galaxy and, far more importantly, within the greater good. There has also been suggestions that it might be even a tiny bit addictive, just a skosh. So, the Tau of course set about organising Vespid society in a way that would benefit the wider Tau society. Utilising their crystal-based technology is obviously the first step. Unfortunately, the Tau simply couldn't vibrate their own little butt cheeks to produce the same kind of frequencies that the Vespids could, which meant that the Tau, no matter how they tried, couldn't really utilize Vespid technology. So they set about installing their own little agents, Vespid commanders that were granted certain privileges and, of course, duties in organizing the rest of Vespid society in a fashion pleasing to the Ethereals. These Vespid commanders were given special communication helmets. They are the only ones who are given the proper, full versions, and they tend to be extraordinarily fond of them for some reason, even wearing them beyond the necessities of their usual communication purposes. Furthermore, these commanders, these strain leaders, then explained the concept of the greater good and the orders in question to the rest of Vespid society, which apparently just kind of accept it. It is important to point out that not all Vespids have been given a communication device, and as such, not all of them have been given a good waft of ethereal gases, and yet they seem to not really have any real problems with obeying the blue-skinned aliens who came to their planet first as enemies and now as beloved friends. It is also very possible that, being an insectoid species, they have some form of limited hive mind, and as such, once the Tau started convincing some of them, they de facto started convincing all of them. Regardless of the precise and, at the end of the day, utterly unimportant truth of the matter, after all that matters is that they understand and obey the greater good. What particular use could the Vespids be put to? Well, originally the Tau had quite a lot of designs on their technology, but due to the fact that the technology is quite literally bound so irreversibly to the Vespids, well, they were somewhat disappointed in that particular pursuit. However, the Vespids themselves have proven to be rather useful for their violent tendencies. The fact that they are naturally armored with an exoskeleton and are equipped with diamond-hard claws, along with their weapon technology, which is, if very, very specific and only useful for the Vespids, is still very, very effective. It functions as kind of a baby Necron gauze flare, in that when it hits something, it starts tearing apart the target on the molecular level, atom by atom. This means that it is extraordinarily effective against lightly armored troops, and can also put a pretty damn serious dent in heavily armored troops, depending on the sheer amount of armor carried by said troops. But whatever armor they can't destroy with their blasters, they can rip open with their diamond-hard claws. Again, this is a species remarkably well suited to fighting a certain mechanical foe, isn't it? Coincidence, I'm sure. And, of course, these are not their only advantages. Their neutron blasters and their claws are further enhanced by the fact that they are capable of seeing in 3 different spectrums, which makes them extraordinarily useful in all kinds of environments. And, of course, the bastards can fly, which is very, very useful indeed, since this means they can be used essentially as rapid hit-and-run troops that require fairly little in the way of supply. Whilst battlesuits, of course, require a fairly considerable support network to keep running, the Vespids can be just as mobile as a battlesuit, whilst of course not being able to carry around quite the same amount of firepower, but all it needs is, well, food. And presumably a steady access to their little crystals, as they do burn out eventually, although relatively slowly. I'm sure that the Tau Ethereals will also, out of the kindness of their hearts, make sure that their commanders are always within easy access of a resupply point filled to the brim with ethereal gases, obviously, for their own good, naturally. And additionally, perhaps their best trait is the fact that they are loyal to the greater good. Whilst the Kroots could be said to fulfill much the same role as rapid maneuvering hit-and-run shock troops, they are not, technically speaking, loyal to the greater good. They are mercenaries. They will fight alongside the Orcs, if they could. They'll even fight alongside the Imperials, if the Imperials didn't have such a nasty habit of simply shooting them at any given opportunity. The Kroots are, in other words, somewhat unreliable. They're reliable as long as the Tau can keep paying them, but the Vespids, well, they'll stay loyal regardless of how badly fucked the Tau economy might eventually become. And of course, if you've got the choice between a fanatically loyal weapon, or a weapon that might turn upon you if you don't feed it regularly, the choice is rather obvious. And so concludes my short video on the Vespids. Now, I will be doing the Death Watch next, but before that, I am going on my 2-week summer vacation. Normally, I would do this the month after this, but I'm currently in kind of a position where I'm going to basically be away for an entire week, so I figured, might as well do it now. So you won't hear from me next week or the next week, but after that, I will hopefully be back with a Death Watch video. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.